Howdy, everybody. Good to see you all again after a little bit of a hiatus there. Take a little break, taking care of the family, celebrating Father's Day. My little one turned 2. Uh, wife was a little under the weather, but here we are, back at it. Break was, you know, it was a good thing. Um, Feeling really energized. And yeah, back at it for the member series. What is this, part 3 or 4 of the Atlantis series? We're going to tie in a little bit more of the Africa excerpts. Well, then we're going to break off into the Great Mystery, um, another article from the early 1900s about Atlantis. And that is a big one that we'll read probably a third of, maybe half of, and finish off this series with. And then we'll invest a little more time with the Etruscan mysteries and connect that with the Yucatan. And then we'll be hopping into Mexico. Next month is going to be Lemuria. So we'll touch on that a little bit. And then, yeah. So appreciate your patience and your interest. Your time is precious. Let's get right into it. We're going to, like I said, finish up with a little more information on the Africa side of the Atlantis narrative. And then we're going to hopscotch back to another full page article that we'll read about a third of, maybe half of. We'll see. Keeping these all around 20, 30 minutes. But yeah. So again, members, appreciate you. Your support is fantastic. Those watching this further down the road, love you as well. So yeah, let's get right into it. Scientist discovers remains of Atlantis. This is from 1911. The article we'll be reading next is from 1913. Exploring on the southwestern fringe of the desert of the Sahara, where the sand dunes touch the fertile territory of the Black Kingdoms of Ashanti, Togo, and Dahomey, Leo Frobenius, that should be familiar, a German student of race types, has found evidence which he believes establishes the existence of the legendary continent of Atlantis. He asserts that Atlantis was not an island, as the Grecians believed. He places it in the northwestern part of Africa, in a territory lying between the Mediterranean and the Gulf of Guinea. And he is of the belief that the Athenians of old invaded Atlantis many centuries before the venerable priest in Egypt gave to Solon the story of the great island of the sea, which was submerged and which Plato later described in the Critias. Plato was of the deadly Incarnus class of brainy Greeks. He believed that what he wrote, albeit his philosophy, was oftentimes imaginative. But no one has ever said that he deliberately tried to befool Athens with his story of the lost island of the sea. According to Plato, Atlantis was a continent lying over against the Pillars of Hercules, or the Rocks of Gibraltar, as they are now called, and of greater extent than Libya, which is the larger part of the African desert and Asia Minor put together. Atlantis was supposed to have been connected with Europe by a chain of smaller islands. It was peopled, according to the legend of Plato, by a fighting race which was powerful enough to array itself with the force against the forces of Egypt, Greece, and all the countries bordering on the Mediterranean. The fighting men of Athens met the Atlanteans in battle and overthrew them. Then came the earthquake, and with it the cataclysm, and following the wave tumult Atlantis was no more. Poseidon, the Greek equivalent of Neptune, was the god of the sea and ruled over Atlantis. All this according to well-preserved fact, or weird and ingenious fancy, relates to a time more than 10,000 years ago, but the German explorer feels that he is linked today with the almost unthinkably remote yesterday by his discovery on the desert border of an ancient bronze head of a man bearing the insignia of Poseidon. He says that the bronze dates back to a period ages before the Athens of Plato and Solon. The head is of a slightly Mongolian type. The features are finely molded, the workmanship unlike that of anything created in the land where it was unearthed. The cast is hollow. He also has unearthed remains of granite figures, vessels of pottery overlaid with glass of various colors, burned clay portraits of classic beauty, and quartz pillars. Many of these relics of a remote age are in pieces, but they can be compared with the works of classic antiquity. Togoland, where the Frobrinus expedition made its base, lies between Dahomey, a name somewhat similar to the musical comedy, and Ashanti on the Gold Coast of the Gulf of Guinea. 20 centuries have civilized the natives of these countries with the respect to the partial elimination of chops and steaks cut from the human as articles of general diet. When one mentions darkest Africa and neglects to specify the post office, he means either Dahomey or Ashanti. They are both pronounced brunette alike as to color, deeds, and past. Before England, France, and Germany, inspired by love for the black brother, not to mention the gold hidden in the hills, began to use him as a target for both artillery and infantry. He was as happy and contented as a slave as ever wore a ring in his nose. When King Tofa, to mention only one of the long line of breech-clouted monarchs, gave a Sylvan 5 o'clock tea, which, according to rule, required the sacrifice of 115 or more slaves, there were always double that number awaiting in line and anxious to be decapitated. Birthday sacrifices called for 250 volunteers. At the betrothal of a princess, which polite ceremonial was conducted by the king and the young galleon in bronze gladiatorial costume, now somewhat familiar on the vaudeville stage. Now, this is interesting because as we get farther into the Etruscan narratives, we're going to find that the origins of the gladiatorial combats come from the Etruscans long before Rome. And they certainly weren't feeding them Christians. So that narrative is going to take a little bit of a turn, but that's a good connection here to what we're talking about. We're going to talk a little bit about the Berbers next, too, and kind of show some of that overlap. The Ganches. At the death of a king, which was generally due to the form of cannibal dyspepsia, no fewer than 2,000 of the serf rank and file were told off to accompany the potentate on his journey into the unknown. Sudden and happy deaths marked every festive occasion. Dahomey Amazons. In these countries, there have always been two classes of women, the stay-at-homes and the militants, who are called Amazons. These latter are famous fighters. Instead of daughters of the regiment, in Dahomey land, they have regiments of daughters. A generation ago, they fought with bows and arrows. The queen's own archers were marvelously fine shots. Now, the Dahomey background is very interesting. Um, there's some weird Queen of Sheba overlays and also some Queen Calafia overlays, Queen Khalifa, which when we get into our Lemuria series, we're going to start talking a little bit more about the Amazons and Queen Khalifa and kind of show a general overlap between the two. Apart from facial characteristics, there are some things in common between the blacks of those border countries and the slaves of early Greece. Women fought in the ranks in prehistoric Greece. Human sacrifice was not unknown there, as Homer bears witness. Still, the German explorer does not seek to trace a connection between the West African and the Greeks. One thing may be said with perfect freedom on the general subject of the new location of the lost Atlantis. The dimensions of Africa are such as to permit of a very considerable country being dropped down there without crowding. The extent of the desert of the Sahara can hardly be realized by one who has not had his attention expressly called to its geographical limits. From east to west, its length is about 3,000 miles. From north to south, more than 1,000. It is a territory comprising 33,500,000 square miles, thus equaling in size nearly the whole of Europe and exceeding the area of the United States. Nor is it destitute of population, for though no census has ever been made of its wandering tribes, estimates place the population of the desert at 2.5 million, consisting of Moors, Arabs, and Negroes. Now, lots of interesting distinctions there, okay? Phenotypes versus religions versus, geographically. Now, as we get into the Yucatan in Mexico, we're going to find that both or all three Moors, Arabs, and Negroes were related to not only the Mayan and Aztec, but you're going to find the Danzantes, the Z, the Chinese, and also the Etruscans have a formation of these same three phenotypes, as well as white skinned. Okay. Skin color and phenotypes and all these things were held in very different esteem than it. And all of the races were found in Atlantis. These people are either engaged in a form of trade suggesting grand larceny or buy and sell camels on the hoof. Now, this is really interesting again because we're connecting things like the Amazons back to not only South America, but North America, Central America. The camels, as well, the oldest camels are found in America. The largest camel skeletons are found in America. Camels existed in Siberia fairly recently. So, connecting again the fall of Atlantis, perhaps the fall of the vapor canopy, and the loss of the tropical northlands in a very, very recent era, much closer to our time frame than we're told. In the western Sahara, to the south of the Algiers, there stands in the middle of a sand plain a triumphal arch, erected, as the Moors say, in honor of a great victory gained there over an enemy that isn't named, but as recent explorations prove, really erected by a Roman emperor to celebrate his victory over the natives. The once great city of Timgad has just been dug out of the desert sands. Now, for those who haven't followed my work before or seen some of my Twitter posts, um, the early 1900s, pre-World War One, they were finding all kinds of crazy stuff in the Sahara Desert. Cities buried hundreds of feet below the sand. And when you look at old maps, it's not hard to believe because the desert of the Sahara is a relatively new creation. And northern Africa was covered in monumental cities. It's seeming like the whole rest of the world. Fortifications in Togoland. Over to the eastward, 2,000 miles or more in the Libyan desert, which is the largest part of the all embracing Sahara, there still can be seen near Mor Saba the ruins of a once great city. Its walls are crumbling, but the portions of its fortifications, which are still well outlined, indicate that the enemies of the country, whatever it was called in that long ago time, were not far away. Also, down in Togoland on the southwestern border of the desert, there are fortifications suggesting a knowledge of warfare such as was possessed by the people on the more civilized side of the Mediterranean. When a continent or an island 1,000 miles or more square has been mislaid for 10,000 years, it is only natural that there should be some speculation as to where it originally stood. Plato's description that it lay to the west of the Pillars of Hercules seemed to fit about the position of the Canary Islands, although there are but specks on the deep. When it was found during the last century that the ocean bed north, south, and west of the Canaries lay nearer the surface by many hundreds of feet than it did elsewhere, the opinion was expressed that the submerged plateau was the original Atlantis and the Canaries the lofty mountain tops over which the engulfing waters did not rise. So, yeah, fantastic to highlight again the overlays between the Dahomey Amazons and the Amazons of South America, as well as the Amazons of North America, a woman only tribe. One can only look to um, Wonder Woman. The overlays there are very powerful. Um, a tribe concealed by advanced technology from a previous advanced race where women were betrayed and made a tribe um, where men were not allowed. Also, the advanced ancient bronze head of a man bearing the insignia of Poseidon, the bronze dating back to a period before the Athens of Plato and Solon, and that the head is of the slightly Mongolian type. Workmanship unlike that of anything created in the land where it was unearthed. Very important things to highlight there. Obviously, connections between North African, the Gulf of Guinea, the Grecians. Um, yeah. So from there, we're going to pivot really quick and we're going to read a little bit about the Berbers and see some overlays there and why that's important. But the Mongolian overlays, if you remember in my previous video, we were talking a little bit about Frobenius and his expedition and many of the other connections that he had made, and the phenotype skull and the tech, some of the sculptures and the pottery work connecting Africa again with much of the American Southwest, where they're finding not only what they call Etruscan jewelry, but Greek pottery, just like we talked about in um, Alaska as well with the Etruscan video. So we're going to hop over here real quick and we're going to read from the book Atlantis, The Evidence by Emma John Sweet. And it's not a very long bit here. And then we're going to hop into Mysteries of the World. And that's where we're going to finish this episode. Hope everyone's enjoying this series. These are going to all be kind of hopscotch transitional periods between material each month. Let's zoom in here. Okay. Having described the island, home of these Amazons, Diodorus then goes on to tell how they conquered the Atlanteans and then every people of the northern Africa, finally invading Egypt herself. It would appear that Diodorus' story of the Amazon War of Conquest is identical to the Atlantean War of Conquest described earlier by Plato. Yet the great differences between the details of the two stories leave no doubt that they are two separate traditions and that one has not influenced the other. Evidently, from a very least the time of Herodotus, the peoples of the north, West Africa, called themselves Atlanteans and spoke of a great island in the ocean which they or their ancestors had earlier inhabited. But why, by the time of Diodorus, where the natives of the region have transformed the Atlanteans into Amazons and have made the Atlanteans the victims, not the perpetrators of the aggression? The answer lies in the word Amazon. The modern natives of the region, the Berbers, to this day call themselves collectively Im-Azigan, free men, singular Amazigh, and it is evident that Diodorus derived the word Amazon from this. It is also possible that the ancient Berbers worshipped a goddess figure or was said to have been ruled by a queen. This would have reinforced the Amazon idea in Diodorus or his informant's mind. It seems clear that the ancient peoples of northwest Africa, whose modern ancestors are the Berbers, called themselves both Atlantioi and Amazigh, and the mighty island empire, which both Plato and Diodorus agree was volcanic and stood in or near the Atlantic Ocean, was inhabited by the Atlantioi, Amazon, who are seen as both aggressors and victims in the account of Diodorus. In this context, we might reflect on the fact that any imperial power in whatever region of the world always begins by subduing its neighbors, people of related stock. As we have said, the modern descendants of these ancient North African Atlanteans are the Berbers. Contrary to what is often imagined, the Berbers are not Arabs, nor are they even closely related to the Arabs. True, nowadays most of them speak Arabic and are all Muslim. In addition, many of them have Arab blood and look somewhat Arab. But that was not the case when the original Berbers, and there exist to this day populations of Berbers, particularly those inhabiting the remoter regions of the Atlas Mountains, who are relatively unmixed with Arab immigrants and who look very much like the original inhabitants of the region. In short, they are white-skinned, blue-eyed, and often fair-haired. These traits are most common in modern times amongst the Rifts of Morocco, many of whom could be mistaken for Northern Europeans. At one time, the Berbers Amazigh occupied the whole of North Africa, stretching from the borders of Egypt to the Atlantic coast. Those living closest to Egypt were known as the Meshawah, Meshuesh, or Tenu. Meshuesh or Tenu. Now, this is really interesting. This kind of shows a overlap again when you look into um, language overlaps. You'll find Moses and Meshik and Thoth overlaps here. So those living closest to Egypt were known as the Meshuesh, Meshwesh, Meshuesh, or Tenu. They made war against Egyptians on many occasions and are faithfully portrayed in full color. Now, so this tribe that has a very similar name to not only Thoth but also Moses made war against the Egyptians. Interesting. And are faithfully portrayed in full color on Egyptian monuments. Here they are clearly shown to be pale skinned like the Europeans. In Greek legend, Atlas, the father of the Atlanteans, was the son of a Titan named Epitus, who was himself the son of Uranus. It is of interest, perhaps, that the biblical tradition of the father of the white peoples, the Europeans, is named Japhet. The Berbers, the modern descendants of these ancient Libyans or Atlanteans, still have a legend of a great island, their original homeland, that stood in the Atlantic Ocean. Contemporary Berber storytellers, particularly in regions less touched by the modern world, will recite this language to anyone wishing to hear it. It is a story that could almost have been written by Plato himself. The Canary Islands lie off the western coast of Morocco. Today, they are part of Spain, but at the start of the 15th century, they were still inhabited by mysterious white-skinned and frequently blue-eyed people called the Guanches. Much has been written of the Guanches, yet there is still little that is certain. There seems to be little doubt that their language was a branch of the Berber tongue, and that they themselves were a surviving relic of the ancient Libyan Atlantean race. When discovered by Europeans in the 14th century, they were said to have lost the ability to travel by sea, and the various islands of the archipelago existed completely isolated from each other. Some of them, it is said, were greatly surprised when they saw the Europeans, believing, as they did, that the rest of humanity had been destroyed in a catastrophe that had earlier brought ruin to their own homeland, a great island in the ocean. So, yeah, um, wonderful. Again, we're going to follow the Ganges into the Gulf of Mexico, into South America, Brazil, hi Brazil. Um, we're going to connect the Ganges with the Basque. We're going to connect the Ganges with the Micmac. We're going to show that there was a diversified trade still going on across the Atlantic, and that these Ganges were just remnants, like many of these people. Again, the Aztecs and the Mayans have stories like this too, that they were remnants. Okay, some cataclysm. And then remember, Atlantis wasn't just one city; it was a confederacy, essentially scattered all over. And yeah, so Atlantis being in Africa, of course, it's possible, and very likely it was a outpost of Atlantis, and survivors tracing their connections post deluge, post cataclysm. Here we're going to look at the Ganges really quick before we call it a day and wrap this one up. We're going to read a little bit of the next article to give you a kind of a teaser of what next episode holds and how we're going to wrap up the Atlantis series in this next article and bridging the gap to the Yucatan. Now, the Ganges were indigenous inhabitants of the Canary Islands in the Atlantic Ocean, some 100 kilometers west of the North African coast. They spoke the Guanche language, which is extinct in the 17th century and is believed to be related to the Berber languages. Now, again, the Berber languages have a really interesting connection with the Basque languages, which have another really interesting connection with, quote, Tartarian languages or phonetic languages, the Phoenicians, again, the Finnish. It's going to relate to the Etruscans. It's going to take us into the Gulf of Mexico as well. Now, they had one of their most reverent symbols was the swastika. Why did it do that? Stop screen. Okay. Present. Show screen. Window. There it is. So yes. Where was I? Yeah. So we're connecting all these ancient peoples again. Like who were the Romans before what we know of as Romans? And again, so they had a very similar religion to the Buddhists. And animism was their foundation, that everything was alive and part of and everything was a piece of the whole essentially. And a very advanced religion and a very advanced understanding of the world. You know, God was within, and we were all part of God. And yeah, so the remnants here are very interesting. These people were isolated, and like they stated that um, when rediscovered, quote rediscovered in the late 1300s, 1400s, the times vary. I would put that much closer. You know, the Columbus narrative and the rewriting by the Portuguese and the Spanish. The dates get really cloudy. But again, remember we discussed the Mongolian phenotype references to the skulls, the bronze skull with the Neptune symbolism, right? And Columbus was leaving the Med in Spain to go to Asia, where he expected to run into ancient Hebrew speakers, which is going to be a connection again with this Berber Basque correlation here and the Ganges as well. So, yeah, to take away from that article, we're going to connect more things with the Amazon River, right? The great river of the Mississippi, the great river of the Amazon. These were all territories of Atlantis. I think Donnelly does the best job when he said it wasn't just one place. Here are the main river systems: the Nile, the Mississippi, the Amazon, right? The Mediterranean and the Gulf of Mexico being two of the biggest hubs. And once we finish in the Atlantic region and all the areas touching the Atlantic, which is Atlantis, the whole region, not just an island, we're going to hop over to the Pacific and start talking about Lemuria and show the connections between the two and why that's important. So, yeah, we're not going to touch too much on the Ganges. We could talk about it all day. The Numidians, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians. Yeah, it's all going back to um, Atlantis and kind of building the connections again between the two. So now we're gonna hop into here, and we're gonna read just a little bit of this. Okay, just a little bit. The great mysteries of the world, the lost Atlantis. Supposed to have been wiped out by a great deluge, lost continent will remain a standing challenge to students of antiquities. Plato's relation of Egyptian priests' history of the great island. Some morning I shall pick up my paper and see on the first page bold, triple banked headlines to the effect that a dispatch from Cairo announced that some Egyptologist has discovered a Seb al Hagir, a set of inscriptions that wholly confirm Plato's relation of Egyptians' priest history of the lost continent, Atlantis. I believe in Atlantis, and so am confident the inscriptions must lie somewhere at the roots of what was ancient Salos. When they are found, and the main mystery will be solved. No man then will have the temerity to pooh-pooh the tale as exaggerated mythology. What a story may be unfolded. Those who have been amusedly interested in Solon's. I'm going to zoom in a little bit for you here, sorry. Solon's bequest may reconsider it with awe and amazement. One of the great obstacles of students of history, of course, has been the proclivity of ancient writers to mingle gods and goddesses and supernatural vagaries with the historical data. This is markedly true of Plato's discourse in the dialogue form concerning the Atlantean Empire and its appalling end. The great student of the Atlantean manners, the late Ignatius Donnelly, whose memorable work Atlantis contains nearly everything known concerning the half mythical land previous to 1879, rightly used the dialogues as a basis from which to project the daring conjectures which were the cause of its rejection by the sober matter of fact of public. The mass of casual readers were not prepared to accept anything so sweeping, so visionary, say, as his fifth and sixth propositions as follows: that it, Atlantis, was the true antediluvian world, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Hesperides, the Elysian fields, etc., and that the gods and goddesses of the ancient Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Hindus, and the Scandinavians were simply the kings, queens, and heroes of Atlantis. The 11th proposition was that Atlantis was the original seat of the Aryan or Indo-European family of nations, as well as the Semitic people, possibly also of the Turanian races. Now, Turanian races have their roots with camels in Siberia, which we're going to get into as well, showing again that this Atlantean, quote, Atlantean cataclysm, I think, was far closer to our time frame now. It will be some later, some it will be some later, even if lesser man, who will demolish Adam and Eve and tear their problematical locality away from the region of Upper Mesopotamia, who will make Noah and his ark a substantive myth and the biblical flood only an echo of a far earlier cataclysm. No credited anthropologist will subscribe in his day and time to an assertion that the more important branches of the human race sprang from the region of the Azores instead of the Indo-Iranian plateau, now commonly accepted theory. However, so comprehensive is the Platonic discourse, so germane to this consideration, that it is given here with a non-essential parts omitted. Its history is that Solon, the father of laws for the Athenians, visited Egypt about 600 BC and indited an elaborate poetical work, which came into the possession of his equally great descendant Plato, who lived about 400 BC. So we're going to pause there. We're going to finish. As you can see, this is a huge article. We're going to finish this article off and then do a kind of wrap up episode where we cover a lot of the interesting correlations we made, crisscrossing the continents, and then we're going to tie it into the Yucatan, High Brazil, South America before we hop into our Lemuria series. So, 2 more episodes after this one with a wrap up at the end. Appreciate you all very much. Thank you for your patience. And see you for the next episode. Thanks, guys. Bye.